about how we were going to get to a profile or a portrait or a picture of Jesus. And the first part of that process is a historical study of the Jewish world prior to the time of Jesus. Because if we can get a fairly accurate picture of what it was like to be a Jewish person, Jewish man in the first century, then we'll have at least, maybe a little bit fuzzy around the edges, but we'll have at least a pretty good idea of what it was like for Jesus in the first century, being a Jewish man. So, there's other reasons as well for doing this kind of study, and that is that for Israel, for Jews in the first century, their present experience was always seen and understood by them through the filter of their past. We don't normally do that with our own lives. And so this is a new thing for you that I want you to start thinking about. This is very true. This is what I'm going to explain to you is fundamental to understanding the Gospels. Because the Jews in the first century interpreted their present experience and their lot in life, the things that were happening to them, through a cogitation or a thinking through and a thinking about their past. It's just that simple. And maybe it sounds a little bit quirky to you, a little bit weird to think that the past and the present could be so connected, because we live in a world, a scientific world, where we feel as though the present is the present and has no necessary, indissoluble connection to the past. And so I just invite you to begin thinking this way, and it's one of the ways that I'm going to explain some things from the Gospels and the way that they explain Jesus. So, her past was the key to her future, and not just her future, but her present. I talked about this at a little bit more length on the last lecture, and so I'm not going to go into that. What I'm going to do instead is I'm going to start, normally in my Life and Teaching of Jesus class, I start somewhere about here and move forward to the period of the Roman domination. But I'm going to do very quickly. I'm going to quickly move through, starting with the Exodus. Okay? How many of you have had Exodus, Deuteronomy in here? Let me ask it a different way. How many of you haven't had Exodus, Deuteronomy? Raise your hand. How many of you are not very familiar with the history of Israel? Raise your hand. Oh, most of you are. So maybe this is redundant. That might be the case. Nevertheless, my spin on it, the way I tell the story is a little bit unique. And so bear with me for a little bit of time, and all this is doing is providing a little bit more context. I want to start with the Exodus and move through the conquest, the United Kingdom, the divided kingdom, the fallen kingdom, period of the exile, the return, the Hasmonean dynasty, and finally we'll end up to the Roman period, which is first century when Jesus lived. And what I would like to do in at least quickly talking through these different historical periods in Israel's story is bring up and highlight the people, places, things, events, promises, and tragedies that they experienced. The sort of stuff that they carried with them as they went on the journey. Okay? It's very important. And you can help me out here since most of you are familiar with all of this. you guys can jump right in here and help me out since you know the kind of stuff that I'm after. Let's just start filling in these columns. During the period of the Exodus, which of course began with Moses, who was the leader of the Exodus. We're talking about the book of Exodus in the Old Testament. I'll just put Moses here. Tell me some other things that happened during this period, the period of the Exodus. Things that happened, people that were important, etc., etc. And I'll give you only a limited amount of time to respond. And then I'll do it myself. Come on, guys. The plagues. Okay. The plagues. Very good. There were 10 plagues. The last plague was which one? Number 10 was the plague of death. And it's from this last plague that a religious festival emerged. Passover, thanks. Passover was one of the three major festivals in the practice of Judaism, even to this day, and it's very important to understanding who they were. Have you guys ever participated in a Passover Seder? That's good. Yes? You haven't? You have? Good. I live in Crestline, California, and my neighbors are Messianic Jews. Messianic Jews are Jewish Christians. Today they call themselves Messianic Jews. And they invited me one year to a Passover Seder at their house. It was a wonderful experience because they go through a meal and there's symbolic relevance to all the parts of the meal. And they retell the whole story of the Exodus through the eating of this meal. It's pretty cool. And they do this every year, and there's little kids' games that they play. They get their kids involved, so at a very young age, the children are told this story. And not just told the story, but they even eat things that make them think about events. Like, they have to eat horseradish. And the horseradish is the bitter herbs. And these bitter herbs stand for the pain and the suffering and the oppression that the Jewish people were experiencing in Egypt. And so the little kids get to eat horseradish. Have you ever taken a spoonful of horseradish? Well, it's one way to sort of think about the whole problem of suffering. Eating horseradish. It's very effective for children. And anyway, if you ever get a chance to eat a Passover Seder with a Jewish family, do so. It will be an enlightenment for you. I used to have someone from Jews for Jesus come into my class and do a Passover Seder for the whole class, but I don't do that anymore, but it was fun to do that. So the 10th plague was the plague of death. Sort of gave rise to the celebration of Passover, and that's because the people of Israel had to kill a lamb and take the blood from the lamb and wipe it over their doorpost and go into their house and stay there. And then the angel of death, as he passed through the cities of Egypt, if he saw blood over a doorpost, he would not enter into that house, and that family would be spared the plague of death on the firstborn of all children and animals. Okay, good. Plagues. Anything else? Good one. Promise of deliverance. The whole Exodus story is a story of deliverance or liberation. In our generation today, there's a whole movement, theological movement called liberation theology, which is primarily has to do with the liberation of oppressed people in third world countries. Very interesting. But deliverance, and the deliverer was Moses. He was the liberator. He was the one through whom the people of God were going to experience liberation. Anything else? Wilderness journey. Good. By the way, Exodus, the word Exodus in Greek means two words. Ek means out of. Hodos is the word for road or path. Exodus means the path out, the road out of suffering. It's good news. It's interesting that in the Gospel of Luke, Gospel of Luke, chapter 9. The transfiguration story of Jesus. I'm going to give you an example of how they use something from this to explain something about Jesus. Okay? In Luke chapter 9, the story of the transfiguration of Jesus, when Jesus went up on a mountain with a few of his disciples, and he was transformed in their presence so that he looked like, a heavenly being. His robes became white, and he shined, and he just looked like a heavenly being. Well, Moses and Elijah appeared there on the mountain with him. And Luke is the only gospel writer who tells a little bit of the conversation that Moses and Elijah and Jesus were having. Let me read it to you. Verse 31. Two men were talking with him, and they were Moses and Elijah. Moses represents the law. Elijah represents the prophets, two of the fundamental revelational modes of God's will in the Old Testament through the prophets and the Torah. So Moses is the Torah, Elijah is the prophets. So we have Jesus meeting them on this mountain with the law and the prophets. Two men were talking with him with Jesus, who, appearing in glory, were speaking of his departure, which he was about to accomplish at Jerusalem. So what were they talking about? They were talking about his departure that he was about to accomplish at Jerusalem. That's the translation that I have in the New American Standard Version. So it's Luke, what did I say, 9:31? Departure. They were talking about his departure that he was about to accomplish in Jerusalem. Now, what in the world is that? It sounds like, they were just talking about whatever's going to happen in Jerusalem. It's still quite a ways away. I mean, this is chapter 9. Jesus doesn't get to Jerusalem for quite a while yet. I don't know how your translation has this translated, but the word departure in Greek, in the Greek text in Luke 9:31, is the word Exodus. It's the word Exodus. What were they talking about? They were talking to Jesus about the Exodus that he was going to accomplish in Jerusalem. Now, doesn't that make a little more sense? No? No? You guys are supposed to shake your head, yes. Okay, makes a lot more sense, doesn't it? Here's the point, guys. They were talking with Jesus about his exodus. They're referring to his death as an exodus. Now, how is that? How is Jesus' death an exodus? What is an exodus? Well, the exodus for the Jews was a liberation from bondage. Luke has just interpreted Jesus' death for you. He just put it in your lap. Jesus' death is an exodus of a different kind, but it's an exodus. It's a liberation from bondage. Who's in bondage? You. So you see, they're using words, ideas from their past and they're reinterpreting them. They're filling them with new meaning. It's a very beautiful example of the Exodus theme appearing in the Gospels. Jesus is going to perform a new Exodus. In that sense, I guess he's like a new Moses, huh? New Moses, new Exodus, new liberation, new people. Very exciting stuff, I think. What else happened in the Exodus story? Plagues, the deliverance, the wilderness journey. The wilderness journey, how long did that last? 40 years. And what happened in this wilderness journey? All right, at the beginning of it, you got the Ten Commandments, this time of wilderness wandering. The gospel writers used this whole wilderness wandering motif. Can you think of a place where they use it? I might have mentioned it to you last week in passing. But the temptation narrative. The temptation narrative is Jesus, the Son of God, is wandering through the wilderness for 40 days, just like Israel, the Son of God, wandered through the wilderness for 40 years. You see that? It's in Exodus chapter 4, verse 22, that God says to Israel, "You are my firstborn son." So who was wandering in the wilderness for 40 years? Israel, the Son of God. We get to the story of Jesus, and Jesus, the Son of God, wanders in the wilderness for 40 days, being tested, like Israel was being tested. You see how they're doing this? You see how they're using elements from an old story to retell a new story? Do you see that? That's the way they interpreted their present. It's the way they interpreted the significance of events. Very significant. Anything else? Good. The tabernacle. Very good. While they were out in the wilderness, and Moses was up on the mountain, and he was given directions, right, for how to build the tabernacle. And the tabernacle was, what was the tabernacle? Who said tabernacle? Okay. What was the tabernacle? It was a place where they worshiped God, yeah. It was the designated place where God would actually make his sort of presence in their midst known. His footstool, his throne would be in the tabernacle. So it was going to be the center of worship for the Jews. It was portable, right? Tabernacle, King James English, but tabernacle is a tent. Tent. A tent. This tent was the dwelling place of God on earth. The word in Greek for tent is skene. Kind of a cool verse I want to read to you from the Gospel of John. I'm reading from the Gospel of John, chapter 1, verse 14. And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we beheld His glory. Dwelt. Do you know that? Do you know what word that is? Dwelt. And the Word became flesh and tented among us. That's the Word. You know, if you were a Jew in the first century and you read that passage and you saw skenao, the Word became flesh and tented, whoa, guys, come on. They're doing some serious theology here. John is saying that Jesus is the new dwelling place of God on earth. That's heavy. Jesus came, the Word became flesh and tented, or dwelt among us. The significance of that, of course, goes all the way back to the Exodus story, because the tabernacle was where the presence of God tented among the people. Pretty cool, huh? You see how they're interpreting Jesus and His life? They're using stuff from their past to do it. That was their method. That's the way they did it. Anything else? The tabernacle. What was in the tabernacle? Huh? Well, there was a bunch of stuff in it, right? Can you think of anything? I mean, the Ark of the Covenant. You guys have seen the Indiana Jones movie, right? The Ark of the Covenant. What was inside the Ark of the Covenant? Do you remember? The Ten Commandments, the stone tablets, the second edition of the stone tablets. Remember, the first edition got splattered. Moses was on his way down the hill with the Ten Commandments in his hand, and he saw the people worshiping a golden calf, so he took the stones and he threw them down the hill. They busted up, so he had to go back up and get volume 2, edition 2, whatever. Those stone tablets were put inside the Ark of the Covenant. What else was in there? Do you remember? Yeah, very good. Very good. Moses' staff was in there. The one that he did all of his miracle working with. What else was in there? Well, you remember when they were wandering in the wilderness and they got hungry? And they were saying, you know what, we were better off in Egypt. We don't like this at all. We're hungry, we're hot. You know, we had things better in Egypt. At least we had food to eat. So God said, okay, I'll provide food for you. And it was called manna. Thanks, manna. So manna was provided. It was sort of an ambrosia, huh? It was sort of like, it's called in Philo the food of the angels, okay? The food of the gods, ambrosia. They didn't think it was so hot, right? Because they got tired of it real quick. They ate it for a few days, and they wanted a little variety. And they started complaining about the food that God provided for them. So they took some manna and put it inside the box. It's kind of interesting, you know. There's not a whole lot of stuff that was put into the box, the Ark of the Covenant. Everything that was put into the box sort of had a symbolic value for. You've got all of this stuff inside the box that represents all of their sin. And then what happened on the Day of Atonement is the high priest would take blood in and he would pour it over the box so that God, who was seated above the Ark of the Covenant, would look down and he would see all of the sins of Israel covered with blood on the Day of Atonement. And that's what the atonement of blood represented. Represented the covering of their sins with blood. Did you have a question? Well, it rotted, except, you know, it was kind of magic in the box. That stuff in the box didn't rot. Okay. All right. Good. Yeah, the manna only lasted a day. They could only take a day's worth. Anyway, okay. So the tabernacle had all kinds of things in it, and these things had a lot of significance. Had a lot of significance for the people of Israel. By the way, how recently have you read through the Gospel of John? Just curiosity. Do you remember when Jesus said, "I am the bread of life"? Do you remember when he said, "I am the bread which comes down out of heaven"? Lights coming on? That's the story of the manna, the giving of the manna. This happens all the time in the Gospels. All the time. So Moses was a prophet. He wasn't just a prophet. Moses was like the prophet. He was the man. Nobody in Israel was greater than Moses. Nobody. In fact, Philo, a Jewish historian, roughly contemporaneous with Jesus, said about Moses that no one born of woman is greater than Moses. Similar to what Jesus said about John the Baptist. Moses is the man. He is the prophet. Every prophet after him would be compared to him. He was sort of like the archetype. And in Deuteronomy chapter 18, verse 15, Moses told the nation Israel, "After I die, God will raise up another prophet like me." Remember that? The prophet like Moses. The prophet. They were expecting another prophet like Moses. In fact, in the Gospel of John, do you remember when the Jewish leaders were questioning John the Baptist? and they asked him, "Are you the prophet?" Remember that? They said, "Are you the prophet?" This is the prophet they're asking him about. And we learn from the book of Acts that the early church explained Jesus' significance as the prophet, like Moses, who would be sent after him. Anything else from the Exodus story? We've got a deliverance, we've got the prophet, we've got the Torah. I never mentioned that, but the Torah was given. The tabernacle, the Passover, lots of stuff happened in connection with the Exodus story. Anything else? Okay, we can move on. After Moses died, they still hadn't gone into the Promised Land yet. They're still roaming around. And in fact, a whole generation of people died in the wilderness. And who is it that led them into the Promised Land? Joshua. Okay. Joshua led them in. Hebrew, that's Yeshua. In the Greek translation of the Old Testament, that's Jesus. This word you should be familiar with because it's the word Jesus. Maybe we should call Jesus Joshua or whatever. Doesn't matter. But the point I'm trying to make here is that the successor to Moses was Joshua. He led them into the Promised Land. I'm sure that this, although I'm not sure of any place that this is actually developed in early Christian literature, I'm sure that this point didn't escape their notice, that the man who led them into the Promised Land was Jesus, Yeshua, Jesus. Typology meant a great deal to them. So Joshua led them into the land. While they were in the land, they were governed by judges. Some of the judges you're familiar with. The two books in the Old Testament that talk about this conquest are the book of Joshua and Judges. One of the things that we learn in Joshua and Judges is that the notorious enemy of Israel were the Philistines. And the people of Israel, the armies of Israel, spent a lot of time fighting the Philistines. The first... Yes, question?
Is there any relation between the word Philistine and Palestine?
Yeah. As a matter of fact...
Israel has been fighting over the last, however many years, Israel and Palestinians, while also Israel fighting against Philistines. Are they the same?
Oh, well, I don't know if that connection should be made, but actually, yeah, the land of Palestine comes from the Philistines. Yeah. So, good point. So the Philistines were the proverbial bad guys and the perennial enemy of Israel. They just couldn't seem to get rid of them. In fact, it was largely because of the Philistines that the people of Israel wanted a king, because they thought if they had a king who was a man of war, who could marshal an army, who could, with military strategy, they might be able to defeat the Philistines. And so their quest for a king led the prophet, whose name was Samuel, to anoint the first king of Israel, and his name was what? Saul. Saul was the first king. Now, Saul had a lot of the qualifications that were necessary, or that were that were needed by the people at that time. They needed a military figure. They needed somebody who could lead an army, someone who could put together an army and defeat the Philistines. And Saul was kind of that guy. I mean, he was a big guy. If you remember the story of David and Goliath, you remember that when David finally showed up on the scene, and David himself, we'll learn, was a man of war himself, but when David showed up, he volunteered to go out and do battle with Goliath, and he tried to put on Saul's armor, but it was too big for him. So Saul was a big guy. I mean, I don't want to caricaturize him, but he was sort of like the Arnold. Very good. Arnold Schwarzenegger. No disrespect. That's a good example. Good example. So we've got Saul with a size 50 chest and a size, now I'm not saying this about Arnold, but size 2 head, okay? So, no, I'm not really. But the qualities that they needed in a king were not necessarily diplomacy, okay? They didn't want somebody with a PhD from Harvard in political science. They wanted somebody from Annapolis, They wanted a Marine. They wanted a man of war. And they got it in Saul. He was a good fighter, but he was not very smart at all. Not very smart at all. During this period of Joshua and the Judges, when the people of Israel entered into the land and they started giving out the land to the different tribes, the land was doled out to the different tribes. It was called the patrimony of each tribe. There was division between the northern tribes and the southern tribes. They had some conflict. And one of the things that Saul failed to do is he failed to provide leadership for the people in other areas that were important. He wasn't a very good businessman. He wasn't a very good politician. He wasn't very good at actually taking care of the needs of his people. He was much better with a sword in his hand, okay? And that's why the next king that came along made him pale in comparison. The next king that came along, king number 2, was King David. And King David was a phenomenon. He was not just a man of war. He was not just a brilliant military strategist, but he was also a good leader for his people. He was a good politician. He was a good diplomat. And he was good at making both sides happy. And he did some extremely important things. David ruled for 40 years. This is known as the Golden Age. David was the ideal king. Every king after him would be compared to him, just like Moses was the ideal prophet. So David was brilliant, effective. He was a religious leader for his people. He was a spiritual leader. He was a military leader. Couldn't ask for much more. Some of the things that David accomplished. that actually united the northern and the southern tribes is that probably the most important thing that he did was he took the tabernacle, which was in the southern region of the kingdom, and he moved it to a central location so that it was equidistant from the northern tribes and the southern tribes. This made the north very happy, so that when they had to make a pilgrimage to the temple, the tabernacle, for a religious festival, they didn't have to travel farther than the people in the south. Just fairness, just a small thing, right? Maybe you might even think it's a petty thing, but it was brilliant what David did. He just moved it. He moved it to the city of Jerusalem. Now, the city of Jerusalem was inhabited by other people at the time, and so David had to actually conquer the city, but that was no big deal. He conquered the city, he moved the tabernacle there, he moved it became the capital, the center. All of his offices were there. The palace, the king's palace. Actually, the palace wasn't built yet. It would be built by his son, but it was the headquarters, Jerusalem. It became known as the city of David. That was brilliant. And it made everybody happy. He eliminated the Philistines. The Philistines were the proverbial burr under the saddle of the Jews in the occupation. David eliminated it. He was good. He completed the conquest. You know, between the time the conquest began and the time that it was completed was about 250 years. For 250 years, the people of Israel were in the Promised Land trying to complete the conquest of the land. David did it. Can you see why this guy was popular? He made plans for a temple. He was going to take the movable breakdown tent, which was the dwelling place of Yahweh, and build Yahweh a house, a temple. He made plans for this. In fact, he started to collect building materials for it. He never actually did the building. David was much too busy to do that. He reigned for 40 years, and for 40 years he was at war. Things never settled down enough. He neither built a temple or a palace for the king, but he made plans for them both. The fifth thing, and this is probably the most significant, is the Davidic covenant. The Davidic covenant was the promise that was made to David. I have to read this to you. 2 Samuel chapter 7. Verses 12 to 15. When your days are fulfilled and you lie down with your ancestors, I will raise up your offspring after you, who shall come forth from your body, and I will establish his kingdom. He's promising David a dynasty. he will build a house for my name. And I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. Now listen to this. I will be a father to him, and he shall be a son to me. So the Davidic covenant was the promise of a dynasty, a Davidic dynasty in Israel. Every king after David would be from David's line. Yes, question? Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. 2 Samuel 7, verses 12 and following. So God says, I'm going to establish your throne forever. Someone from your loins, from your seed, will rule over Israel forever. And I'll be a father to him, and he will be a son to me. Interesting. Here we have the what's the word? Implementation? It's not the right word. We have the beginning of divine sonship in Israel. Royal divine sonship. From David on, the king would be a son of God. Psalm chapter 2. Psalm chapter 2 is an enthronement psalm. It's one of the psalms that was sung at the coronation of the king. And one of the things that is said about the newly coronated king is, "You are my son, today I have begotten thee." Divine sonship of the king. You see why it's significant in the Gospels when Jesus is called Son of David. And even why sometimes when a mention is made of Son of God, it is a reference to his right to be a king over Israel. We sometimes think ipso facto. Whenever you see Son of God, it means God. Not so. Not so. So David was promised a dynasty, and it would last forever. Wow. What an honor and what a blessing. David was the man. The king that followed David, what's his name? Solomon. So king number 3 was Solomon. Son of David, Solomon. He also ruled for 40 years. Now, while his father had 40 years of warfare, Solomon had 40 years of peace. Never once did he have to defend his borders. There's a variety of ways. I don't know if you guys are interested in the intrigue of international relations and politics, but if you're the ruler of a nation and you have like 10 different countries on your borders, there's a variety of ways of maintaining peace with these border countries, right? One way is to strong-arm them. Huh? Another way is to marry their king's daughter. That's what Solomon did. He had like 700 wives. "700 wives." This guy had 700 wives. Okay? He married a lot of princesses from neighboring nations. He formed a lot of political alliances through these marriages. And while he's also known as the father of wisdom, because the whole wisdom theological tradition in Israel goes back to Solomon. One can, wonder about some of that wisdom. But in some ways, he was extremely bright and extremely wise. But he did make some questionable decisions in his life. But he was a smart guy. He was very smart. Right after he took office as king, there was an incident that happened. I'm not sure where this occurs. Maybe some of you know. There was an incident that came up. And by the way, after Israel had a king, they no longer had need for judges because all of these cases between the people were brought to the king. And he resolved them. The judges did. Well, Solomon was newly coronated king, and a problem came up between a couple of women. These were single women. They lived together. They both had children, babies. And it happened that one night, one of the women, she rolled over on her baby, smothered it, died. She woke up, noticed her baby was dead. She freaked out, so she took the baby and she took and replaced her child, or she traded the child of her roommate. So her roommate wakes up and the baby by her side is dead. Doesn't even look like her baby. Then she sees her roommate. Anyway, you know what happened, okay? So she says, "You took my baby." The woman says, "No, I didn't." So they took it to Solomon. Solomon heard both of their stories, and this is the way he handled it. He said, "I know how to resolve this and make both of you happy." He said, called for one of his swordsmen. He said, "Lay the baby down, cut it in half, and give each one of the ladies half of the living baby." Okay? Risky. Worked out good, though, because right before the baby was cut in half, the real mother said, "Stop!" And Solomon was sort of banking on that happening. He was sort of counting on the real mother stopping the killing of the child because she couldn't stand to see her child killed. And that happened. And, it's kind of good that it did because this could have easily backfired, couldn't it? But it worked out okay for Solomon, and everybody thought, "Whoa, man, he's smart." Okay, it worked out good. So he obviously had some very good ideas. And he ruled for 40 years. 40 years of peace. He built the temple, and he built a palace for himself, for the king. Then he dies. And when he dies, the kingdom, the united kingdom that belonged to David and himself, that had lasted now for 80 years, the united kingdom fell apart. Because two people came forward and claimed that they were the rightful heirs to the throne. So all of a sudden now, we had 80 years of united kingdom, and then Solomon dies and the kingdom splits again into the north and the south. Let's say the United Kingdom lasted from 1020 to 960 CE. CE stands for Common Era, another way of saying BC, before Christ. Common Era. No, BCE, I'm sorry. We want BCE, before the Common Era. So the United Kingdom lasted for 80 years, and then it divided from 960 on. There was a fracture in the kingdom, in the north and the south, and they both thought, okay, do you remember the Davidic covenant? I shouldn't have erased that. Because this is extremely important. After this fracture of the north and the south, both kingdoms felt that they were the rightful heirs to this covenant. That they were the recipients of the promise. That God was with them, not the other one. And this sort of bitterness between the two lasted all the way until 722 BCE. In 722 BCE, the Assyrians, who were the enemies of Israel from the north, the Assyrians defeated the northern kingdom. Now, when the Assyrians came and defeated the northern kingdom, they really wiped them out. The Assyrians were notorious for battle. I mean, well, most nations in the ancient world were vicious in battle. And by today's standards, they had no Geneva Convention. And they did things that if we saw being done today, you know, we would be breathless, speechless. But the Assyrians defeated the northern kingdom, and it wasn't enough for them to just conquer the tribes in the north. They took them out of their country and repopulated the country with their own people. This is referred to as exile. They took the Jews in the north into exile. They left a few of them there. The Jews that remained in the northern kingdom were then cohabiting with Assyrians who they had repopulated the area with. Okay, so from 722 BC on, the northern kingdom was gone. This made the southern kingdom very happy, because imagine how it looked to them. Doesn't it look, I mean, if you were them, wouldn't this look to you like God has finally vindicated you? It's sort of like, you know, we always knew that we were the rightful heirs to the Davidic covenant. So they were happy. And I guess their happiness lasted until about 586 BCE, because that's when the Babylonians defeated them and took them into exile. Now in 586, you have no northern kingdom and you have no southern kingdom. And the Jews are scattered throughout the world. They're no longer even in their own land. This was a this was a painful experience, very painful experience for these people. Read the book of Lamentations if you want to see how painful it was. Jeremiah was the prophet in the south who predicted that the Babylonians were going to defeat them. And he didn't want to do it. He was called the weeping prophet. He had to give them a message that he didn't want to give. So we've got the north and the south, they've both fallen. They're both in exile. And we have now the land of Israel that has no more Jews in it to speak of. The city of Jerusalem has been leveled. The walls around the city, which were fortifications of the city and probably 8 to 12 feet thick, the walls were all busted down and leveled. The temple had been destroyed, and the people were in exile. Now, the Babylonians were not Jewish friendly, and neither were the Assyrians. Neither one of these kingdoms, neither one of these people treated the Jews very well at all. The period before this exile is called the pre-exilic period. The period after this exile is called post-exilic. So beginning with the Assyrians in 722, we have the nation of Israel going through various relationships with the nations of the world. And that's why sometimes this period in Israel's history is referred to as Israel and the nations. Because beginning with Assyria, you have Israel going through various kinds of subservient relationships to other powerful nations. Assyria was defeated by Babylon, so Babylon was sort of the major or leading world power in the ancient Near East. In 546, the Babylonians were defeated by the Persians. So once again, in 546, there was a change in power. There was a shift in power in the ancient Near East. The Persians defeated the Babylonians, and they became the powerhouse. Okay. Now the difference, and this was a good thing for Israel, the difference between the Persians and the Babylonians is that the Persians were Jewish friendly. And around 539 BC, the Persians allowed the Jews to return to their land, rebuild the city, rebuild the temple. And you can read about this in the Old Testament books of Ezra and Nehemiah. The return. They go back, they rebuild the walls, they rebuild the temple, and after they get the temple rebuilt, then this period in Israel's history, after the return, is referred to as Second Temple Judaism. This Second Temple would last all the way until 70 CE, when it would be destroyed by the Romans. Sometimes in the literature you guys will run across these terms, Second Temple Judaism. That's just so you know what that refers to. Pre-exilic, post-exilic, First Temple, Second Temple, these kinds of things. Israel and the nations. Just to give you guys a little bit of bearing. The Persians were Jewish friendly. They allowed the Jews to go back to their land. In fact, they even allowed the Jews to be somewhat self-governing. They experienced a lot of freedom under the Persians. It was a mutually pretty satisfying experience for the Jews. And the domination in the ancient world of the Persians lasted until around 322 BCE. In 322 BCE, Alexander the Great, who was maybe the most brilliant military general and genius of the ancient world. Alexander the Great, starting at the age of around 22, began to conquer all of the known world. His ambitions were unbelievable. He wanted to make a one-world government. And he wanted the basis or the foundation of this one-world government to be based on Greek culture, Hellenistic culture. He started around 322 BC. His father was named Philip of Macedon. It's not important, but from the age of 11 on, Alexander was tutored by a guy you may have heard of before, Aristotle. Aristotle was the private personal tutor of Alexander the Great since the age of 11. So this guy had born with a silver spoon in his mouth, huh? But he wasn't just, fortunate in the sense that his father was Philip of Macedon, who was the king of the Greek world, but he was also rich, and he was also smart, very smart. It took him 10 years. It took him 10 years of military campaigning to conquer all of Asia Minor, all of Syria, all of Palestine, all of Arabia, all of Egypt, all of India, and he was on his way to the Orient when his soldiers finally said, "We want to go home. This is enough. This is enough." But anyway, guys, 10 years. He did this in 10 years. Sometime, just look at a world map and just see how much he did in 10 years. How much land he actually conquered and claimed for this new Hellenistic kingdom. Pretty substantial. In fact, you could compare the Roman world and the Greek Hellenistic world, and you can compare them and see that the size of Alexander's kingdom after 10 years was about equal to the size of the Roman Empire after 500. A little bit of context for you? It's hard to exaggerate this guy's brilliance, his ability. And one of the neat things about Alexander the Great is, I have 11:06. We still have 4 minutes, right? Okay. The neat thing about Alexander was that he just loved other cultures. I mean, he wasn't this culture-bashing, people-hating warmonger that you might imagine. He actually enjoyed meeting other cultures. And he really wasn't into culture bashing at all. In fact, when he met the Jews, he just finished conquering the city of Tyre, which is north and west of Jerusalem. But when he came down to Jerusalem, the high priest and the people from Jerusalem opened the gates of the city to him, and they walked out and they said, "Our prophets told us you were coming. We have read about you." And they were referring to various places in the book of Daniel. And Alexander says, "Cool." Well, he didn't say cool. Might have said something like that, but he said, "I also had a dream about you." And he went in and he he was hosted and shown hospitality, all of his army, by the Jews in Jerusalem. And you know what? He said to them, I'd like to see your temple. And they said, well, you can see our temple, you just can't go in because it is against our religious traditions to allow any Gentile into our temple. And he said, fine. He said, fine. Now, guys, that's an interesting guy. He really liked learning about the people that he conquered. In fact, you know what his army said about him? When he finally got to Persia and defeated the Persians in the Mesopotamian Valley, when he finally got there, he married a Persian princess, and he took a lot of Persian soldiers and made them part of his army. And his own soldiers didn't like it. And they were saying things like, we started out to make the whole world Greek, and our leader has become a Persian. But that was Alexander. He really, the sense that I get of him is that he was very, very friendly to cultures that were different than his. And no doubt this helped him a lot. This was very conducive to what he was doing. But it was also good for the Jews. The rest of the story, beginning around 165, isn't so good. And I'll talk about that on Thursday. So on Thursday we'll begin here after the beginning of the Hellenistic kingdom, and we'll get into the Roman period. And read